They told her to eat outside like she didn't belong, but they didn't know who was watching. Rain poured in cold sheets across the marble courtyard, each drop hitting Lena Brooks' thin uniform like needles as she stood frozen at the edge of the grand terrace, a porcelain plate trembling in her hands, steam long gone, the food already turning cold. Behind her the glass doors glowed warm with golden light, laughter spilling out from inside, like she was standing on the wrong side of the world. Staff eats outside. The manager had said earlier, not even looking at her, just pointing toward the storm like it was nothing, like she was nothing. And when Lena hesitated for just a second, clutching the tray tighter, one of the guests, a woman wrapped in silk and diamonds, had smirked and added loud enough for everyone to hear, "Well, don't just stand there, sweetheart. Rain won't hurt you." And the room had laughed, not cruel in volume, but sharp enough to cut. Lena stepped out without another word, the heavy doors closing behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing her outside as thunder rolled in the distance. She found a small spot near the stone steps, the rain already soaking through her sleeves, her curls damp against her skin, but she didn't move, didn't complain, didn't look back. She simply sat down and placed the plate on her lap like she'd been taught, quiet, invisible, grateful for whatever she was given. Even now, her fingers tightened slightly as she picked up the fork. But before she could take a bite, another burst of laughter echoed from inside, and when she glanced up, she saw it. Phones lifted, silhouettes pressed near the glass, recording her, capturing this moment like entertainment, like a joke she never agreed to be part of. Her chest tightened, not from the cold, but from something deeper, something familiar, because this wasn't new. This wasn't the first time she'd been made to feel small, and somewhere inside that mansion, behind layers of marble, power, and silence, a man sat at the head of a long table, pen in hand, signing deals that moved millions. Alexander Romano didn't usually notice small things, not when his world demanded precision, control, and constant calculation. But tonight, something shifted. Maybe it was the flicker of movement against the glass. Or maybe it was the reflection of a figure sitting alone in the storm while everyone else stayed dry. His pen paused mid-signature, just for a second, his eyes lifting slowly, locking onto the image outside, and for a moment, the room continued as if nothing had changed. Voices carried on, glasses clinked, someone kept laughing, but Alexander didn't move. Not yet, because what he was seeing wasn't just a maid in the rain. It was something else entirely, something that didn't sit right in a world he controlled. And as the seconds stretched, the weight of that silence began to press down on everything. Unseen, but impossible to ignore, the rain kept falling, steady and relentless, turning the stone steps slick beneath Lena Brooks as she lowered her gaze back to the plate in her lap, forcing her hand to stay steady even as her fingers felt numb from the cold. She told herself to just eat, to get through it like she always did, because this job mattered, because rent was due in 4 days and her younger brother needed his medication, and pride had never paid a bill. But inside, the warmth and laughter only grew louder, echoing through the glass like a world she was never meant to enter. And behind that glass, Alexander Romano remained still, his pen hovering above the contract, the silence around him beginning to stretch in a way that made the men seated nearby exchange uneasy glances. One of them cleared his throat softly, another shifted in his chair, but no one spoke. First, because when a man like Alexander paused, it meant something. Even if no one understood what yet, his eyes did not leave the window, did not leave the image of Lena sitting alone under the rain. And then something else caught his attention, a flicker of movement not outside but inside, reflected in the glass. The same guests who had laughed were now closer to the doors, some holding up their phones, their faces lit by screens as they recorded, smiling as if this moment was entertainment. And that was when his expression changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone could immediately name, but subtly, like a line had been crossed somewhere deep beneath the surface. Alexander slowly set the pen down on the table, the soft click against the polished wood louder than any voice in the room. Conversation stopped almost instantly, the air tightening as every eye shifted toward him. He did not raise his voice, did not ask a question. He simply leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze still fixed beyond the glass. And for a brief second, The only sound that existed was the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the windows. Lena adjusted her posture outside, trying to shield her plate from the worst of the downpour, her shoulders curling inward as another gust of wind sent a chill through her. She took a small bite finally, the food cold and tasteless. But she did not flinch, did not complain, because she had learned long ago that dignity was something you held quietly, even when no one else saw it. And inside, Alexander stood, slow and deliberate, the movement instantly commanding attention without a single word. Chairs shifted as men straightened. Someone began to speak, but stopped halfway through, unsure, the weight of his silence heavier than any command. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve with calm precision, his expression unreadable, and then he turned, not toward the head of the table, not toward the contract waiting for his signature, but toward the glass doors, each step measured, controlled, the room parting around him without being told. And still, no one understood what he was about to do, only that something had already changed, and that whatever came next would not be ignored. The glass doors opened without a sound, but every head inside turned as if something had shattered, because Alexander Romano stepping away from the table was not a small thing. It was a decision, and decisions like his carried weight no one in that room could ignore. The warm air from inside met the cold rain outside as he crossed the threshold, his polished shoes darkening instantly against the wet stone, but he did not slow down, did not hesitate. Lena Brooks looked up at the sudden shift in light, her first instinct to stand, to apologize for something she did not understand, but the words never came, because he was already there, standing just a few feet in front of her, rain touching the edges of his suit, his presence cutting through the storm in a way that made everything else feel distant. For a moment neither of them spoke. The laughter from inside had vanished completely now, replaced by a silence that pressed against the glass from both sides. Lena's fingers tightened slightly around the fork as she lowered her gaze, expecting correction, expecting dismissal, expecting the same quiet reminder of her place that she had heard her entire life. But Alexander did not speak those words. Instead his eyes moved to the plate in her lap, the food barely touched, rainwater collecting along the rim, and then without asking, without announcing anything, he reached down and took the plate from her hands. The motion slow, deliberate, so calm it almost felt unreal. Lena blinked in confusion, her breath catching slightly as she looked up again, unsure if she had done something wrong, unsure if this was the moment everything fell apart. But Alexander had already turned, not back toward the doors immediately, but slightly to the side, as if measuring something unseen. The rain continued to fall around them, steady, patient, and then he did something no one inside was prepared for. He stepped closer to her, close enough that the space between power and invisibility no longer existed, and he lowered himself, not fully seated, but enough that he was no longer towering above her, his posture shifting in a way that erased distance instead of enforcing it. Lena's eyes widened just slightly, her confusion deepening into something else, something unfamiliar, because no one like him had ever chosen to meet her at eye level. Not once, not ever. And inside the mansion, pressed against the glass, the guests watched in stunned silence, phones still raised but forgotten, because this was no longer entertainment. This was something they did not understand, something they could not control. Alexander lifted the fork from the plate, the same fork Lena had been holding seconds before, and without a word, without looking away from her, he took a bite, slow and deliberate, as if the act itself carried meaning far beyond the food. The rain fell harder, the world seemed to hold its breath, and in that quiet, undeniable moment, everything shifted. The bite was simple, almost unremarkable, but the effect it carried moved through the air like a quiet shockwave, because Alexander Romano did not rush, did not react. He simply chewed slowly, calmly, as if nothing about this moment was unusual, as if sitting in the rain with a soaked plate of cold food was exactly where he intended to be. Lena Brooks could not look away, her breath shallow, her mind searching for an explanation that did not exist, because men like him did not do things without reason, and yet there was no command, no correction, no judgment in his eyes, only a stillness that felt heavier than anger. Behind them, through the glass, the guest stood frozen. The woman who had laughed earlier, now lowering her phone slightly, uncertainty creeping across her face as the Scene unfolded in a way she had not planned for. The room that had once been filled with amusement now held something far more uncomfortable. Silence that demanded reflection. Alexander lifted the fork again, taking another bite, rainwater tracing down his sleeve, his posture unchanged, deliberate, controlled. And then finally, he spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying just enough to reach the doorway without ever rising above it. Is this how we treat people who work under this roof? The question was not directed at Lena, not directed at anyone specific, but it landed inside the room with unmistakable weight. No one answered, no one moved, because the answer had already been exposed in front of them. Lena felt something shift in her chest, something fragile and unfamiliar, because for the first time since she had stepped into that mansion, she was no longer invisible. Alexander turned his head slightly toward the glass, his gaze sweeping across the faces watching, not with anger, but with a clarity that made avoidance impossible. If she eats here, he continued quietly, then we all do. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that left no room for interpretation. A staff member near the doorway hesitated, unsure, until Alexander's eyes met his for a brief second, and that was enough. The man nodded quickly and disappeared inside. Moments later, movement erupted behind the glass, not chaotic, but urgent, tables shifting, voices lowered, the carefully constructed atmosphere of superiority dissolving into something uncertain, something human. Lena remained still, her hands resting empty in her lap now. Rain continuing to fall around her, but it no longer felt as cold, because something had changed, not just in the room behind her, but in the space between who she was and how she had been seen. Alexander stood slowly, returning the fork to the plate with the same calm precision he had carried into the moment. He looked down at her briefly, not with pity, not with sympathy, but with recognition, the kind that did not need words to be understood, and then he turned back toward the doors, stepping inside without another glance, leaving behind a silence that no one dared to break. And outside, Lena Brooks sat in the rain, no longer alone, even as the storm continued to fall inside the mansion. The shift was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the kind of change that moves through a room without needing permission. Staff who had once moved quietly now stepped with purpose, carrying trays toward the doors. Guests who had laughed moments ago now stood unsure of where to look, their earlier confidence dissolving under the weight of what had just happened. The woman in silk who had made the remark earlier remained near the table, her expression no longer amused, her posture stiff as she glanced toward the glass, and then quickly away, as if avoiding the reflection of her own actions. Alexander Romano walked back to his place at the head of the table, his suit damp at the edges, but his presence unchanged, controlled, composed. He did not rush to sit, did not immediately resume the meeting. Instead, he rested his hand lightly on the back of his chair, his gaze moving across the room slowly, not searching, not accusing, simply seeing. And that was enough to make every person in that space aware of themselves in a way they had not been before. One of the senior guests attempted a quiet laugh, a weak effort to restore the atmosphere, but the sound faded almost as soon as it began, swallowed by the silence that now filled the room, because something fundamental had shifted, not in the structure of the evening, but in the understanding of it. Outside, Lena Brooks watched through the glass as movement unfolded inside, trays being gathered, doors being approached. She did not fully understand what was happening, only that it was. Because of what had just occurred, because of a moment that did not feel real, her hands rested on her knees, still slightly trembling. But her posture was no longer folded inward. She sat straighter now, not out of defiance, but because something inside her had been acknowledged, even if she could not yet name it. The doors opened again, this time with purpose, staff stepping out into the rain, placing trays along the terrace, their movements careful, respectful, not rushed. One of them glanced at Lena briefly, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition, as if seeing her for the first time. The rain continued to fall, but the space around her no longer felt like exile. It felt shared, inside. Alexander finally took his seat, the chair sliding quietly beneath him. He picked up the pen again, but he did not sign immediately. Instead he spoke, his voice calm, even, carrying across the table without effort. We will continue. he said, not as a command, but as a statement of control, and yet the meaning behind it extended beyond the contract in front of him, because everyone in that room understood that what they had just witnessed was not an interruption, it was a correction, and corrections like that did not fade. They stayed, they reshaped the way things would move forward. The woman who had laughed earlier lowered her gaze to the table, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass, no longer the center of attention, no longer untouchable in the way she had believed moments before, and Alexander did not look at her directly, did not call her out, because he did not need to. The silence had already done that. Outside, Lena reached slowly for the plate again, but this time, she hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she realized something had changed. Something quiet, something irreversible, and as the rain softened just slightly, the world around her felt different, not warmer, not easier, but fair in a way it had not been before the rain softened into a steady drizzle, no longer pounding against the stone, but lingering in the air like a quiet reminder of what had just unfolded. Lena Brooks sat still for a moment longer, watching as more trays were placed along the terrace. The scent of warm food mixing with the cool dampness around her. It felt unfamiliar, not because of the setting, but because of what it meant. No one had told her to move, no one had corrected her, and for the first time since she had arrived at the mansion, she did not feel like she was waiting to be dismissed. She picked up the fork again, her movements slower now, more deliberate, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Each bite no longer something she rushed through, but something she allowed herself to take. Inside, the meeting continued, voices lower than before, measured, cautious, as if every word now carried more weight than it had earlier in the evening. Alexander Romano listened more than he spoke, his posture composed, his presence steady. But his attention was no longer confined to the papers in front of him. It extended. Beyond them, beyond the table, beyond the room itself, a man seated across from him attempted to redirect the conversation toward business, outlining figures and timelines. But even his voice carried a slight hesitation, as though unsure if numbers still held the same importance they had just minutes ago. Alexander finally signed the document, the pen moving smoothly across the page. But the act did not carry the same finality it once would have, because what had been decided outside had already altered the tone of everything inside. He set the pen down again, this time without pause, and leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more toward the glass, not searching, not questioning, simply confirming. Outside, Lena noticed the shift in the atmosphere around her, other staff members now moving with a quiet respect that had not been there before. One of them offered her a dry napkin without speaking, placing it beside her gently. She nodded in acknowledgement, a small gesture, but one that felt significant, because it was not given out of obligation, it was given out of recognition. The guests who had once filled the room with laughter now remained inside, none stepping out into the rain despite the invitation that had been silently extended. They stayed where it was warm, where it was safe, but their silence followed them, heavier than the storm itself. Lena glanced briefly toward the glass, her reflection faint against the lights inside, and for the first time, she did not look away immediately. She held her own gaze for a second longer, as if testing something new, something fragile but real. Inside, Alexander stood once more, signaling the natural end of the meeting without needing to announce it. Chairs shifted, conversations resumed in softer tones, but no one rushed to leave. As if each person needed a moment to process what had taken place, he adjusted his jacket, now dry except for the edges that still held traces of rain, and began to walk toward the exit of the room, not hurried, not delayed, simply moving with the same controlled precision that defined everything he did. But as he reached the doorway, he paused for just a fraction of a second, his gaze turning slightly, not fully back toward the table, not fully toward the glass, but somewhere in between. A quiet acknowledgement of a moment that would not be repeated, and then he continued on, leaving behind a room that no longer felt the same. And outside, Lena Brooks finished her meal in the rain, not as someone pushed aside, but as someone who had been seeing the terrace slowly emptied as the trays were cleared one by one. The quiet order restored, but not in the same way it had existed before. Something lingered in the air, something unspoken yet understood. Lena Brooks remained seated for a moment after finishing her meal, the plate now empty in her hands. the rain easing into a fine mist that clung to the edges of the stone and softened the sharp lines of the courtyard. She exhaled slowly, not realizing she had been holding her breath for most of the night, her shoulders lowering just slightly as the tension that had built inside her began to release. Not completely, but enough to feel the difference. She stood carefully, brushing her damp hands against her uniform, aware of every movement, aware that the world she was stepping back into was not exactly the same as the one she had left earlier that evening. Inside, guests began to gather their things, conversations resuming in quieter tones, but no one returned to laughter. No one attempted to recreate what had existed before, because it no longer fit. The illusion had been broken in a way that could not be repaired with small talk or polite smiles. The woman in silk lingered near the table a moment longer than the others, her reflection faint in the glass, her expression no longer composed. She glanced toward the terrace once more, her gaze landing briefly on Lena, and then she looked away again, this time not out of dismissal, but out of something closer to discomfort, perhaps even recognition. Lena stepped toward the door, hesitating for just a second before reaching for the handle, her fingers pausing against the cool surface of the glass. Earlier that evening, that door had felt like a boundary, a line she was not meant to cross freely. But now, as she pushed it open, the difference was subtle yet undeniable. It did not resist her in the same way. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her again, but it did not feel distant anymore. It felt shared. Staff moved around her with quiet efficiency, but their glances were different now, no longer passing over her, as if she were part of the background. One of them gave her a small nod as they passed. Another offered a towel, without needing to be asked. Lena accepted it softly, murmuring a thank you, her voice steady, grounded, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not lower her eyes immediately afterward. She held her posture, simple, natural, unforced. Alexander Romano stood near the far end of the room, speaking briefly with one of his associates, his tone calm, his presence unchanged, but when his gaze lifted and crossed the space, it paused on Lena for just a moment, not long enough for others to notice, but long enough for her to feel it, not as pressure, not as expectation, but as acknowledgement, the kind that did not demand anything in return. Lena inclined her head slightly, a quiet gesture of respect, and then continued past, returning the empty plate to the kitchen area, the routine of her work resuming, but not in the same way it had before, because something had shifted inside her, something that could not be undone by a single night or a single moment. Outside, the rain finally began to fade completely, leaving the stone glistening under the soft light, a reflection of a storm that had passed, but not without leaving its mark. And inside, the mansion carried on, quieter, steadier, but changed in a way that no one would openly discuss. Yet no one would forget the night settled into a quieter rhythm as the last of the guests filtered out of the mansion, their polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floors. Conversations reduced to polite murmurs that no longer carried the same certainty they had arrived with. Outside, the courtyard glistened under the dim lights, the rain now gone, leaving behind only the faint scent of wet stone and something else. Something harder to define. Inside the kitchen, Lena Brooks moved with steady hands, rinsing plates, stacking them carefully, returning to the routine she knew so well. But even here, in the back where the world usually forgot her, the atmosphere felt different, lighter in some places, heavier in others, as if everyone had witnessed something they were still trying to understand. One of the senior staff members approached her quietly, not with urgency, not with authority, but with a measured calm that felt intentional. He placed a folded cloth on the counter beside her and paused for a moment before speaking. "You did nothing wrong," he said simply, his voice low, almost respectful, and then he stepped away before she could respond, leaving the words behind like something she was meant to carry. Lena stood still for a second, her fingers resting against the edge of the sink, the sound of running water filling the silence around her. Those words should have been small, ordinary, but they were not, because no one had ever said them to her before, not in a place like this, not in a moment like this. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself, then continued her work, but her posture remained different, no longer folded inward, no longer bracing for the next correction that never came. Across the mansion, in a private study lined with dark wood and soft lighting, Alexander Romano stood near the window, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled neatly, a glass of untouched water resting on the desk behind him. He looked out toward the courtyard where the rain had fallen earlier, the reflection still visible under the light, his expression unreadable, not because there was nothing there, but because what was there did not need to be displayed. A knock sounded softly at the door, and one of his trusted associates stepped in, hesitating just slightly before speaking. "Everything has been handled," the man said, careful with his tone. "The staff has been informed. The rules have been adjusted." Alexander did not turn immediately, his gaze remaining on the glass, on the space where something quiet but significant had taken place. After a moment, he nodded once, a small acknowledgement that carried more weight than any extended instruction. "Good," he replied, his voice even, controlled, and final. The associate waited for a second as if expecting more, but nothing followed, so he stepped back and closed the door gently, leaving Alexander alone again with the stillness of the room. Back in the kitchen, Lena finished her shift, drying her hands on a clean towel before placing it aside. She glanced briefly toward the hallway that led back to the main room, not with hesitation, but with awareness, and then she turned toward the exit, stepping into the corridor with a quiet confidence that had not been there before. The mansion was the same, the walls unchanged, the lights still warm, but the space felt different around her, not because it had transformed completely, but because something within it had been corrected, something that would not easily return to what it had been. And as Lena Brooks walked forward, she did not rush, she did not shrink, she simply moved as someone who finally understood that being seen, even once, could change everything. Morning arrived without ceremony, the mansion returning to its usual rhythm of quiet precision, sunlight filtering through tall windows and settling across polished floors as if nothing had ever been out of place. But beneath that calm surface, something had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way people moved, in the way they paused, in the way they chose their words more carefully than before. Lena Brooks stepped through the front service entrance just after sunrise, her uniform pressed, her hair neatly tied back, the cool air brushing against her face as she entered. She carried herself the same way she always had, steady, focused, ready to work. But there was something different in the way she walked now, not louder, not bolder, just certain. Inside, the staff greeted her with small nods, subtle acknowledgments that required no explanation. The head housekeeper gave her a brief look, then handed her the day's assignments without the usual clipped tone, and Lena accepted them with a quiet, "Thank you," her voice calm, grounded. She moved through the corridors, completing each task with the same care she always had, but without the weight that had once followed her every step. Later that morning, as she passed through the main dining area, now empty and silent, she paused for just a second, her eyes drifting toward the glass doors that led to the terrace. The stone outside was dry now, sunlight reflecting off its surface. No trace of the storm remained, but she remembered it clearly, not the rain itself, but what had happened in it. She did not linger long. She turned and continued on, because she did not need to relive the moment to carry what it had given her. Upstairs, in his study, Alexander Romano reviewed documents with the same precision as always, his posture composed, his focus sharp. But when one of his associates entered to confirm a change in staff policy, he listened without interruption, then gave a single nod. No elaboration, no discussion, because the decision had already been made the night before, and it did not need to be revisited. The associate hesitated briefly before adding, "There have been noticeable differences this morning." Alexander's gaze lifted slightly, not questioning, just acknowledging. "There should be," he replied, his tone even, final. The man nodded and stepped out, leaving the room as quietly as he had entered. Back downstairs, Lena finished setting a table near the window, her hands smoothing the cloth with practiced ease. As she straightened, she caught her reflection faintly in the glass, and this time, she did not look away. She held her own gaze for a moment, not searching, not questioning, simply recognizing, because dignity had never been something given to her before. It had always been something she protected in silence, something she carried alone, But now, it had been seen, and that made it real in a different way. Not louder, not heavier, but undeniable. Footsteps sounded softly behind her, and she stepped aside instinctively. But when she turned slightly, she saw Alexander Romano passing through the room, his presence calm, his expression unreadable. As always, he did not stop, did not speak, but as he moved past, his gaze shifted just enough to meet hers for the briefest moment. And in that moment, nothing needed to be said, no acknowledgement spoken, no gratitude exchanged. Because what had been done was not a favor, it was a correction, and corrections did not ask for recognition. They simply existed. Lena inclined her head slightly, then returned to her work, her movements steady, her posture unchanged. But something within her had settled into place, something that would not be undone by time or circumstance. And as the day carried on, the mansion continued to function as it always had, structured, controlled, precise. But beneath it all, there was a quiet understanding that lingered in every corner, in every glance, in every small act of respect that had not been there before. And in that quiet, lasting shift, the world remembered what dignity looks like.